In the spring of 1830, a 30-year-old farm worker named John Hanks stood on a riverbank in Macon County, Illinois, with an 8-pound maul in his hand and a pile of oak logs at his feet. He and his cousin would split more than 3,000 rails for a man named William Warnick, the first sheriff of Macon County. 3,000 rails, by hand, for one farm. By the 1870s, men like John Hanks had stacked more than 4 million miles of split-rail fence across the American countryside. 4 million miles of timber, swung up by hand, on prairie ground that grew no fences of its own. The story is not the politician who later borrowed the nickname. The story is the labor. I have been reading old county histories from Macon, Illinois, and the diary of Calvin Fletcher. Meet two men. John Hanks was born in Kentucky in 1802 and came west to Indiana as a young man. In 1830, he was 30 years old, living in Macon County, Illinois, and hiring out his arms for wages. He helped build the first courthouse in Macon County. He raised bridges over Stevens Creek. He split rails for Sheriff William Warnick and for any man who would pay. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. Calvin Fletcher was born in Vermont in 1798. He came to Indianapolis in 1821 with no money and a borrowed horse. By the 1830s, he was a banker and a state senator. But he never stopped farming. He kept a working diary from 1817 until his death in 1866. That diary fills 9 published volumes at the Indiana Historical Society. In it, Fletcher names his hired men and records what he paid them by the day and by the rail. A farmer who staked a quarter section of prairie ground in Illinois in the 1840s had a problem. A quarter section was 160 acres. The land was open. The grass ran to the horizon. He had cattle, he had hogs, and he had a corn crop coming up. If he did not fence his crop, his own animals would eat it. The law in Illinois, in Iowa, in Indiana, said the burden was on the farmer growing the crop. You fence your corn, or you lose your corn. To fence 160 acres with a worm-style rail fence took about 8,000 rails per mile of fence line. A quarter section needed close to 2 miles of perimeter. That is 16,000 rails. 16,000 rails, each one 10 or 12 feet long, each one split by hand from oak or chestnut or walnut. One man with a maul and 3 iron wedges, working a long day, could turn out maybe 150 rails on good timber. Lincoln, the most famous rail splitter, was one of many. Settler diaries name local hired men paid by the rail. The work was steady, the work was brutal, and the work built the Corn Belt. Let me tell you what splitting a rail actually looked like. You started before sunrise in the timber strip that bordered your farm. In Illinois, in Indiana, in Ohio, the prairie was mostly open grass, but a thin band of hardwood ran along every creek and river. White oak, bur oak, hickory, black walnut, American chestnut where the soil ran east. These were your rail trees. The first job was the felling. You took an axe, and you swung it for an hour until the tree came down. Then you took a crosscut saw, and you cut the trunk into 10 or 12-foot sections. 12 feet was the prairie standard. 10 feet was used where the timber was rough, and the splitter wanted to save his back. Now came the splitting. You stood the log section on its end, or you bedded it flat, depending on the grain. You took an iron wedge, the small starter wedge, and you tapped it into the very center of the end grain. You used the back of an axe head or a smaller wedge to drive it. Then you reached for the maul. A splitting maul of that era weighed about 8 pounds. The head was iron, the handle was hickory, and the man who used it for a full day had forearms like rope. You swung the maul straight down on the wedge, and the wedge drove into the oak, and a crack opened along the length of the log. Then you set the second wedge in the crack, drove it, set the third wedge in the new crack, drove it, and the log halved. Then you halved the half. Then you halved the quarter. Then you halved the eighth. A 12-foot log of straight-grained white oak, 18 inches across the butt end, would give you between 4 and 8 finished rails, depending on the wood and depending on the splitter. A finished rail was 4 to 6 inches across, 12 feet long, and heavy. A green oak rail weighed 40 pounds. You lifted it, you carried it to the fence line, and you stacked it. Then you went back for the next one. A skilled splitter on good straight timber, working from dawn to dusk in spring or fall when the temperature allowed, could produce around 150 rails in a day. Some old county histories report higher numbers. Some report lower. The 150 figure is the working average that shows up in the settler diaries I have read. I want you to hold that number in your head. One man. One day. 150 rails. Now remember that a single quarter section of prairie needed 16,000 of them. Do that math. That is more than 100 days of full splitting labor for one farm. One farm out of millions. Now let me tell you about the fence itself. The Midwestern farmer of the 1840s almost never built a post and rail fence. Post and rail required digging holes, which on the prairie meant breaking sod and chopping through a root mat that had grown undisturbed for thousands of years. It required a perfectly straight line, true posts, and skilled joinery. It also used about half as much wood as the alternative. The alternative was the worm fence, also called the zigzag fence, the Virginia fence, or the snake fence. The worm fence required no post hole. You laid the first rail on the ground in a diagonal, then laid the next rail crossing it at an angle of about 60 degrees, then the next, and the next, building up a zigzag pattern along your fence line. You stacked the rails crisscross at each corner, and gravity held them in place. A good worm fence stood 8 or 9 rails high, sometimes 10, and was capped with 2 crossing rails at every corner for strength. That is why the worm fence dominated. In 1850, the United States Department of Agriculture Census of Fencing reported that 79% of all American fences were zigzag worm fences. Post and rail was only 14%. Stone walls were 6%. The remaining 1% was hedge, picket, or experimental. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, I am putting them into a series of books. The men nobody wrote a book about, the ones who built this country with their hands. Volume 1 is out now. Scan the code on your screen, or click the link in the description. Then come back, because what happened next is the part most people never hear. The worm fence was wasteful of wood, and the farmers knew it. A 10-rail worm fence used roughly twice the timber of a post and rail line of the same length. But on the prairie, with timber close by and labor inside the family, wood was cheap and post-hole digging was hard. So the worm fence won. Here's the part the old histories underline. A man with a maul in 1840 was not just building a fence. He was building the boundary of private agriculture across the entire interior of North America. Every property line, every cattle pen, every cornfield, 4 million miles by the 1870s. 4 million miles of hand-split oak laid on ground that, 50 years before, had been buffalo range. Now to the wages. The rail splitter was paid 2 ways. By the rail, the going rate in central Illinois was about 1 penny per rail. A skilled man producing 150 rails earned $1.50 for the day. By the day, a farm laborer in the Midwest in 1850 earned 75 cents to $1 with board. Fletcher's diary records hired hands at his woodlawn farm working at these rates. That was decent money. A skilled splitter working 60 days in spring and 60 after harvest could clear $200 from rail work alone. A quarter section of government land cost the same $200. A young man with a strong back and 3 iron wedges could split enough rails in a year to buy his own farm. But the fence cost the farmer, too. In Pike County, Illinois, in 1847, a local newspaper reported that the county's farmers had spent $150,000 to fence their grain fields with rails, at a cost of $100 per mile of fence. By 1853, a writer named Jonathan Baldwin Turner calculated that a wooden rail fence in Illinois cost $300 per mile to build and would last about 12 years before the bottom rails rotted and the corners gave way. $300 per mile. 2 miles per quarter section. $600 to fence a farm. That was 3 times the cost of the land itself. The economics then were brutal, but they worked. The farmer paid more for his fence than for his land. The splitter earned his living 1 penny at a time. The corn went into the crib. The hogs stayed out. The system held together because the labor was there. I want to walk you through a working day on a rail-splitting crew in central Illinois in the 1840s. The crew was usually 2 men, sometimes 3. One was the chopper, one was the splitter, and on bigger jobs, one was the hauler. The chopper went into the timber at first light. He felled the trees and bucked them into sections. The splitter followed behind, set his wedges, and turned the sections into rails. The hauler pulled the rails on a sledge or in a 2-wheeled cart to the fence line, where the farmer or his hired men stacked them into worm panels. The trees they wanted were straight-grain hardwood. White oak was the king. It split clean along the grain, it resisted rot, and a good oak rail would stand 30 years in the weather before the heartwood gave out. Black walnut was almost as good and split easier, but walnut was scarcer. American chestnut, where it grew, was the prized railwood of the eastern Midwest. Chestnut was fast-growing, straight, and rot-resistant. A chestnut rail could stand 40 years. The chestnut blight came later, after 1890, and ended that timber. But in the rail-splitting years, chestnut was everywhere east of the Wabash. The splitter read the log before he set the wedge. He looked at the end grain. He looked for the heart, the medullary rays, the knots. A clean white oak butt with no knots and tight rings would split as if it wanted to. A knotted bur oak with twisted grain would fight you all day and ruin your maul. A good splitter learned to walk past the hard logs and find the easy ones. A great splitter could finish a rail in under 3 minutes, start to finish, on the right wood. There were injuries. The maul, swung wrong, came down on a knee or a foot. A green oak rail under tension could kick when the wedge popped free, and a kicked rail caught a man in the chest and knocked him flat. There are entries in county histories of splitters losing fingers to misdirected blows, of men hurt by falling timber when the chopping went bad. Calvin Fletcher's diary mentions hired hands injured in the woods, sent home to recover, sometimes returning to work and sometimes not. The work was hard on the body, and the bodies that did it were young. Now I want to tell you about the Prairie itself, because the Prairie was the reason all this had to happen at all. When the first American settlers came west into Ohio in the 1790s and into Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa in the 1810s through the 1830s, they hit a country they had not seen before. The eastern forests gave way to grass. Tallgrass prairie ran from western Ohio across central Indiana, through almost all of Illinois, across Iowa, and on into eastern Nebraska. In central Illinois, the prairie was so flat and so wide that a man could ride for 2 days and not see a tree. The settlers feared the open prairie. They hugged the timber strips along the rivers. Every early Illinois town, every early Iowa town, was built on the edge of a hardwood grove. They needed the wood. Wood for the cabin. Wood for the fireplace. Wood for the tools, the wagon, the well rope. And wood for the fence. A settler on the deep prairie, more than a few miles from timber, faced a logistics problem that almost no farmer today understands. To fence his quarter section, he needed 16,000 rails. To get 16,000 rails, he had to travel to a timber strip, fell the trees, split the rails, and haul them by ox cart back to his farm. That haul could be 5 miles, 10 miles, even 20 miles. A 2-wheeled cart pulled by oxen could carry maybe 20 rails at a time. 800 trips. 800 round trips of 10 or 15 miles each, just to fence one farm. This is why until barbed wire arrived, the deep prairie of central Illinois and central Iowa was settled slowly. The settlers stayed near the timber. The pure grass country, the so-called Grand Prairie of east central Illinois, was open range for years longer than the timbered country around it. Cattle grazed it freely. Crops were not planted on it because there was no way to fence them. The Department of Agriculture estimated that by the late 1860s, American farmers had something close to 4 million miles of fence in service across the country, the great majority of it split rail. The estimated replacement cost ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. By comparison, the entire federal budget in 1860 was about $63 million. The American farmer had built by hand an asset worth several times the federal government. Now I want to walk you through the rail-splitting year, because the work was seasonal, and the rhythm of the year shaped the lives of the men who did it. The splitting season ran in two windows. The first was late winter into early spring, from February into April. The trees were leafless, the sap was down, the wood was hard and dry, and the rails split cleaner. The frozen ground let the ox carts haul the rails without bogging in spring mud. A splitter who knew his timber went into the woods on the coldest mornings of the year, his breath white, his maul handle wrapped in cloth so the iron head would not freeze to his glove. He worked through the short days, came home at dark, slept hard, and went back at first light. The second window was after the corn harvest, from late October into December. The fields were in, the crops were stored, and the farmer had time and labor to spare. The autumn splitting season produced rails for the spring fence repairs. A worm fence rotted from the bottom up. The two lowest rails, the ones in contact with the wet ground, gave out first. Every spring, a Midwestern farmer walked his fence line, counted the rotten panels, and budgeted the rails he would need to cut from the timber. In between, in the high summer, the splitter worked the harvest. Wheat in June and July, hay in July and August, corn in September and October. A rail splitter in the Midwest of the 1840s was rarely a full-time splitter. He was a farm laborer who split rails as one of half a dozen seasonal jobs. He plowed in April, planted in May, mowed hay in July, husked corn in October, and split rails through the winter. The same maul handle, the same hickory shaft, served him from one job to the next. The maul went up in the loft when the harvest came in and came back down when the snow flew. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. The wages tracked the season. A man could earn $1 a day in the wheat field in June with food included. He could earn $1.50 splitting rails in March on a piece rate contract. He could earn 75 cents husking corn in the cold barn of November. Across the year, a strong young man in central Illinois in 1850 might bring in $200 to $250 in cash wages, plus board and lodging. The Iowa State Historical Society holds settler diaries from this period that confirm these figures across multiple counties. I want to bring back John Hanks for a moment, because his story illustrates how this seasonal labor pattern worked at the personal level. Hanks was not, in the 1830s and 1840s, a man who split rails for a living. He was a man who farmed, who hauled freight, who worked on county construction jobs, who took whatever paying work came across his path. The 3,000 rails he split for Sheriff Warnick were one contract. He had others. He helped build the Macon County Courthouse, which paid him in cash and in standing. He served on juries, which paid him a small per diem. He moved freight between Decatur and the river landing. Splitting rails was one of the things a man like Hanks did when no better paying work was on offer, and the timber stood ready. The men who specialized full-time in rail splitting were a smaller group. They were often young men, single, without their own land, working a season or two for cash to buy a homestead. They were often immigrants, fresh from Germany or Ireland or Scandinavia, learning English in the timber camps and saving every penny. They were sometimes the second or third sons of established farmers, hired out by their fathers to bring cash into the family. Calvin Fletcher's diary records hired hands of all three types coming through his woodlawn farm in the 1840s and 1850s. Now, let me tell you what the Prairie did to all of this. The early settlement of central Illinois was a story of timber. The settlers came in along the Wabash, the Illinois, the Sangamon, the Spoon, the Kaskaskia rivers. They built their cabins in the timber strips along the water. They walked out into the prairie to plant their first crops, and they walked back to the timber to cut their rails. The first generation of Midwestern farms, the generation of John Hanks and his neighbors in 1830, was clustered tight against the timberline. But the timber was finite. By the 1850s, the timber strips along the central Illinois rivers were heavily cut. A farmer in McLean County or Champaign County, looking for rail timber in 1855, often had to travel 10 or 15 miles to find a stand worth felling. The cost of haulage rose with every mile. The price of finished rails at the Prairie edge climbed from $20 per thousand in the 1840s to $30 and even $40 per thousand by the 1860s. The northern Indiana and southern Michigan country still had decent hardwood through the 1850s. Iowa held its timber along the rivers, but the western counties were almost treeless. Wisconsin had hardwood enough for the southeastern farming counties, but the splitting season was shorter because the winters were longer. Ohio, settled earlier, was already running thin on prime rail timber by 1840. By the time of the Civil War, the entire central Midwest was hunting for fenced timber, and the rail-splitting trade was getting harder and more expensive by the year. This is the material limit of the era. The settlers built 4 million miles of fence with the wood they could reach. When the easy wood was gone, the price of fencing climbed, and the search for a substitute began in earnest. The Osage orange hedge was one early answer. Planted as a thorny living fence, an Osage orange row took 4 or 5 years to grow into a stock-proof barrier, but once grown, it lasted for decades and cost almost nothing to maintain. The Illinois Department of Agriculture promoted the hedge through the 1850s. By 1860, hundreds of miles of Osage orange were growing across central Illinois. But the hedge had its own problems. It took years to establish. It harbored weeds and tree of heaven sprouts. It blocked sunlight on the field edges. And it could not be moved or rebuilt. A wooden rail fence could be pulled up and restacked in a new line in a day. An Osage orange hedge, once planted, was permanent. The hedge worked for some farmers in some counties, but it never replaced the rail fence at scale. The other substitute, smooth iron wire, was tried through the 1850s and 1860s. It was strong, light, and could be shipped by rail. But cattle pushed through it. Horses walked through it. Hogs went under it. Smooth wire did not contain livestock. The fence problem was unsolved. That was the world before barbed wire. Now let me tell you what changed it. In November of 1874, a farmer named Joseph Glidden in DeKalb, Illinois, was granted a patent for an improvement in wire fences. Glidden was 61 years old. He was a New Hampshire native who had come west in 1842 with 2 crude threshing machines, hired himself out across Michigan and Illinois, and accumulated enough money to buy 600 acres near DeKalb. He farmed cattle. He had the same fence problem every other prairie farmer had. Glidden's design was simple. Take 2 strands of smooth wire, twist them together, and at intervals along the twist, insert short pieces of wire with sharpened points. The barbs stayed in place because the twist locked them. The wire was cheap to manufacture. It could be shipped by rail in coils. One man with a fence stretcher and a roll of barbed wire could fence a quarter section in a few days at a fraction of the cost of split rails. Within 5 years, Glidden's wire was the cheapest, strongest, and most durable way to fence a prairie farm. By 1880, more than 80 million pounds of Glidden-style barbed wire were sold annually. The price of a mile of fence dropped from $300 in wood to under $20 in wire. The economics flipped, and the rail splitters' trade flipped with it. Through the 1880s, the worm fences came down across the Midwest. Farmers pulled up the old rails and stacked them as firewood or as the foundation of new outbuildings. The fence corners that had defined the Corn Belt for 40 years vanished, panel by panel. By 1900, a working worm fence was a museum piece in much of Illinois and Iowa. I want to make one more observation about the labor of fencing, because the rail splitter was only half the story. The other half was the man, or the boy, or sometimes the woman, who stacked the rails into the worm panels at the fence line. Stacking was its own craft. The rails came out of the timber green or partly seasoned, heavy and slick with sap. A green oak rail weighed 40 pounds. The stacker lifted each one, walked it to the panel, and laid it across the previous course at the proper angle. The lock at each corner had to be tight or the fence would walk in a strong wind. The angle of the zigzag had to be consistent or the line would drift across the property boundary. A good worm panel was a thing of geometric beauty. 8 or 9 rails high, the corners locked with crossing caps, the line straight from one section to the next. On many Midwestern farms in the 1840s and 1850s, the family did the stacking together. The hired splitters delivered the rails to the field. The farmer, his older sons, and his daughters built the panels by hand. There are passages in settler diaries from Iowa and southern Wisconsin where the women of the household are credited with running the fence lines while the men were in the wheat field. The stacking was lighter work than splitting, but it was constant work, and 160 acres needed a lot of stacked rails. The Civil War interrupted the rail splitting trade hard. From 1861 to 1865, every young man in central Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa who could carry a rifle was carrying one. The farms ran short of hired labor. The fences fell into disrepair. Calvin Fletcher's diary in 1862 and 1863 records his repeated frustration over the difficulty of finding hands. The going day wage rose from $1 to $1.25, then to $1.50, then to $2 for any man willing to work. The wartime inflation pushed the cost of a mile of new rail fence above $400 in some Illinois counties. The pressure on the wood fence economy was already mounting before Glidden's patent arrived to break it. When the soldiers came home in 1865 and 1866, many of them did not return to rail splitting. They had seen the war. They had seen the river towns. Some went west to homestead the open plains. Some went into the new factories of Chicago and Indianapolis. The rail splitting trade, already squeezed by rising timber prices, never recovered its full workforce. By the time Glidden filed his patent in 1873, the trade was already in its final decade. But before that, there was a moment, a 30-year stretch from about 1840 to 1870, when the Midwestern farm was a creation of one man's arm and one swing of a maul. 4 million miles of fence, 8,000 rails per mile. Roughly 32 billion rails standing in the American countryside at the peak. Each one of them was held in a man's hands at some point. Each one of them was split with a wedge and a maul. Each one of them was lifted and carried and stacked. John Hanks, the cousin from Macon County, lived to see all of it. He saw the timber strips of Indiana stripped for rails in the 1820s. He saw the worm fences rise across central Illinois in the 1830s and 1840s. He carried wagons for General Grant in the 1860s. And he lived another 25 years past the war into 1889, long enough to see the barbed wire come and the rail fences come down. He died at 86 in Decatur, Illinois, on land that he had helped fence with his own hands 60 years before. The county history lists him as a wagoner, a settler, and a splitter of rails. Calvin Fletcher lived a shorter span but kept the better record. He died in 1866, just as the rail fence era was nearing its end. His diary, all 9 volumes of it, sits in the Indiana Historical Society in Indianapolis. In it, Fletcher names his hired men, records their wages by the day and by the rail, and tracks the fences they built on his woodlawn farm. The diary is the closest thing we have to a continuous economic record of frontier farm labor in the upper Midwest. It is, in a way, the rail splitter's archive. And then there are all the others. The men whose names did not make the county histories, who hired out for $1.50 a day, who slept in the haymow and ate at the farmer's table, who built the fences and moved on. The ledger gives no name, only a number. A wage figure. A rail count. 16,000 rails for 160 acres, and behind every count, a man with a maul. I have walked the timber strips along the Sangamon River in central Illinois and the Wabash in Indiana. I have seen the old rail fences still standing on a few state historic sites and a few stubborn private farms. The oak gray with weather, the corners still tight, the panels still in their zigzag run. They look exactly like the engravings from 1850. I have run the numbers 3 different ways. 4 million miles, 32 billion rails, $1.50 a day. None of it changes the picture. The Midwest was fenced by hand, by tens of thousands of men, with a maul and a wedge and a long day's work, in the 4 decades before barbed wire arrived to make their trade obsolete. The most famous rail splitter is the one whose name everyone knows. But this is not his story. This is the story of John Hanks and the hired hands in Calvin Fletcher's diary and the unnamed splitters, whose only memorial is a penny mark in a farmer's ledger book. They built the fence corners of the Corn Belt one rail at a time. They were paid by the rail and they were honored by no one. May the work of their hands stand as the monument they were never given. One more thing before you go. Every name I find, every number, every record, I am collecting it all into a series of books so these men are not forgotten again. Volume 1 is available right now. Scan the code on your screen or follow the link in the description. See you in the next one.